Spring 1945. Germany was collapsing, its armies retreating, its cities in ruins. Allied forces pressed from the west, while the Red Army surged from the east, carving a path of destruction through what remained of the Third Reich. For German soldiers, surrender was often the only choice left. But for many who laid down their arms before the Soviets, captivity didn't mean survival, it meant execution. Why? What drove Soviet soldiers in those final months to shoot prisoners instead of marching them into camps? The answer begins years earlier on the blood-soaked soil of the Eastern Front. When Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the Nazis declared a war of annihilation against the Soviet Union. Entire towns were burned, villages wiped from maps, and millions of civilians starved, shot, or deported. The Wehrmacht and the SS carried out atrocities that scarred the Soviet people beyond imagination. The treatment of Soviet POWs was even worse. By the winter of 1941 to 1942, nearly 2 million Red Army prisoners had already died in German captivity, starved, frozen, or executed. Camps like Auschwitz and Treblinka are remembered for the Holocaust, but for Soviets, the open-air fields where their captured soldiers withered away were just as unforgettable. For the Red Army, every dead comrade, every burned village, every civilian massacre etched hatred deeper. By 1945, the men pushing into Germany weren't just soldiers, they were survivors of a nightmare, carrying years of rage. By the final months of the war, this rage boiled over. To Soviet soldiers, any German in uniform represented not just an enemy, but a guilty nation. Whether they were Wehrmacht infantry or SS guards, few distinctions were made on the battlefield. Captured soldiers were sometimes lined up against walls and shot immediately. In villages across East Prussia and Poland, German POWs were executed in front of civilians as symbolic retribution. The logic was brutal. Germany had shown no mercy, so why should the Soviets? Officially, Stalin's orders called for capturing German soldiers for interrogation and labor, but the chaos of combat often left discipline behind. Frontline units, especially those who had discovered mass graves or liberated camps, were consumed by raw anger. Entire SS detachments were massacred after surrendering. Ordinary Wehrmacht units weren't spared either if Soviet troops suspected them of atrocities. The difference between policy and practice was vast. In the field, vengeance ruled. The Eastern Front was unlike any other theater of World War II. It wasn't a war of maneuver or honor, it was a war of extermination, where both sides had crossed the line long before 1945. By the time Soviet troops entered Germany, the idea of mercy had all but disappeared. To them, executing German POWs wasn't just revenge, it was justice delivered on the spot without trial. By 1945, Germany's armies were crumbling, and mass surrenders became a daily reality. Columns of Wehrmacht soldiers, some wounded, some barely teenagers, marched forward with hands raised. Yet for many, surrender was no shield. Soviet troops, hardened by years of slaughter, often chose to empty their rifles into lines of captives rather than escort them to rear camps. Reports describe groups of German soldiers forced to dig their own graves, only to be executed minutes later. Others were driven into barns or forests, shot en masse, their bodies left unburied as warnings to anyone still resisting. If ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers had little chance, SS men had none. To Soviet soldiers, the black uniform symbolized the worst of the war: massacres of civilians, the burning of villages, and the horrors of concentration camps. Captured SS soldiers were often executed on the spot. Some were beaten to death by civilians before they ever reached Soviet custody. Others were marched through villages where survivors of Nazi occupation hurled stones, spat, and demanded blood. There was no mercy for Gestapo officers, camp guards, or men with the SS tattoo under their arm. For them, execution wasn't an accident of war, it was expected. The fall of Berlin in April to May 1945 unleashed chaos. German defenders, Wehrmacht, Volkssturm, and SS were rounded up as Soviet troops poured into the city. In the rubble-strewn streets, prisoners were shot in alleys or executed against walls. The frenzy of urban combat blurred the line between battle and massacre. In East Prussia, it was even worse. Villages like Nemmersdorf had been sites of German atrocities years earlier, and when Soviet troops arrived, they retaliated with executions of POWs and civilians alike. Survivors recall German prisoners lined up on the edge of craters, shot, and left where they fell. Though the Soviet High Command officially ordered the collection of prisoners for interrogation and labor, many frontline commanders either ignored or quietly approved summary executions. For exhausted Soviet soldiers, revenge felt like justice. For officers, it also eliminated the logistical nightmare of feeding, guarding, and transporting thousands of prisoners while the army advanced at breakneck speed. This meant the killings were both spontaneous acts of rage and cold calculations of convenience. A bullet in the head was quicker than escorting captives hundreds of miles east. Executions weren't just punishments, they were a message. To any Germans still fighting, it was a warning. Surrender to the Soviets and death might come anyway. This psychological warfare accelerated the panic inside collapsing German lines, where soldiers desperately tried to surrender to American or British forces instead of the Red Army. For every German prisoner executed on the battlefield, thousands more were shipped east. Soviet policy demanded labor to rebuild what the Nazis had destroyed, and German POWs became that labor force. Millions were crammed into trains and sent across the Soviet Union, to Siberia, the Urals, and Central Asia. The conditions were brutal. Prisoners worked in mines, forests, and construction sites for 12 to 14 hours a day with little food. Disease spread quickly in overcrowded barracks, winters killed the weak, and starvation was constant. For SS men and officers, treatment was even harsher. Survival often depended not on strength, but on sheer luck. Historians estimate over 1 million German POWs died in Soviet captivity, many of them members of the SS or Wehrmacht units accused of atrocities. Unlike in the West, where German POWs began returning home within a few years, Soviet-held prisoners often remained for over a decade. Some were not released until 1955, after political negotiations between West Germany and the USSR. For families waiting back in Germany, the silence was crushing. Letters rarely came, and many wives and children assumed their husbands and fathers were dead. Those who did return often came home emaciated, broken in body and spirit, and reluctant to speak of what they had endured. The executions of German POWs in 1945 blur the line between justice and war crime. On one hand, the Soviets had suffered more than any other nation under Nazi occupation. 27 million dead, cities burned, families starved, and entire regions destroyed. To many Red Army soldiers, executing captured Germans felt like the only fitting response. On the other hand, the summary killings of surrendered soldiers violated the conventions of war. Not all German POWs were guilty of atrocities. Some were conscripts, barely old enough to shave, caught in a machine far larger than themselves. Yet on the battlefield, there was no time to separate guilt from innocence. For Germans, the reputation of Soviet captivity became legendary. Soldiers desperately tried to surrender to the Americans or British rather than fall into Soviet hands. Stories of executions, starvation, and gulags spread quickly, cementing the idea that to be taken by the Red Army was a death sentence. For Soviets, however, these stories carried a different meaning. They were not tales of cruelty, but of retribution. Every German captured, every prisoner sent to a camp was a repayment for the millions lost to Hitler's invasion. In the end, the fate of German POWs captured by the Soviets tell us something chilling about the nature of total war. On the Eastern Front, mercy had vanished long before 1945. The cycle of atrocity and revenge meant that even surrender could not guarantee survival. For many Germans, the war ended not with peace, but with a bullet, a labor camp, or a grave in frozen Soviet soil. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments below. And if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel.